The city lived in its usual rhythm. Gray concrete, honking cars, crowds of people rushing around. The summer of 2025 was scorching the streets with the merciless sun, but passers-by didn't even raise their heads to the sky. They knew that the heat was not the worst of it. The air was heavy, soaked with a mixture of exhaust fumes, unwashed asphalt, and deafening tension. It hung in the alleys, hidden in the storefronts, reflected in the eyes of those who were used to not asking questions. The city had seen too much. Here they knew that if you weren't white, you could always be stopped, asked too many questions, and then turned into a threat. The law existed, but it didn't serve everyone. In the distance, near the police station, a neon sign flashed, "Protect your peace." No one believed those words. Too many lives had been crushed by these protectors in recent years. People read the news, listened to official statements, saw official reports, but then more videos appeared on the screens. Brutality, violence, humiliation. Cameras were filmed, the public was outraged, but nothing changed. On this day, everything seemed calm. Cars whizzed by, street musicians played their tunes, shopkeepers beckoned to customers. Life as usual. But if you looked closely, you could see disturbing details. 2 policemen stood on the corner at the bus stop, tall, strong, with tense faces. They did not look at each other, only forward, studying the street like predators in search of prey. Their hands rested on their belts, where handcuffs, batons, and guns hung. They didn't speak, but their gazes spoke for themselves. Something was wrong. A few blocks away, a teenager in a wheelchair moved slowly down the sidewalk. The wheels rolled gently over the cracks in the asphalt, cutting through the tired city noise. The boy looked calm, or tried to appear so. He'd gotten used to people looking at him with either pity or dislike. He was just driving home. But in this town, just didn't exist. The policeman on the corner noticed him at once. One of them bowed his head slightly, as if to make sure he could see correctly. The other nodded slowly, and the tension between them became almost palpable. They had already made up their minds. He didn't know that in a few minutes his face would be pressed against the dirty asphalt, that breathing would become a struggle, that pain would be his only reality. He didn't know that on that day he would cease to be a human being in their eyes, and would become just a threat. The city had a life of its own, and the city won't stop them. The heat pressed down on the city, spreading sticky sweat on the backs of passers-by. The air vibrated with car horns, conversations, and distant sirens. Life went on, but not for everyone. On the corner of 45th Street, near an abandoned auto repair shop, 2 policemen stood lazily watching people. They had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, and everything was predictable to them. Black teenagers, whom they called street rats, clustered outside stores. People in cheap clothes hurried past, avoiding eye contact. It was business as usual, until they saw him. A black teenager in a wheelchair moved along the sidewalk, his face remaining calm, but his eyes constantly sliding around. He knew he shouldn't attract attention. He had learned that long ago, but for the cops, he's already a target. "Do you see that?" said one of them, squinting his eyes. "Yeah," the other one said slowly, studying the teenager like a predator before it strikes. "What the hell is he doing here?" The first policeman grinned. "Good question. This neighborhood was under their control. They considered it a problem neighborhood, which meant that any black man who showed up here for no obvious reason automatically became a suspect, especially if he looked too calm. The teenager didn't see them, or maybe he just pretended not to. He kept moving, slowly, pushing the rims of the wheels with difficulty. It wasn't easy to move on the sidewalk in a wheelchair. The uneven asphalt kept making him veer off course. "Maybe he has drugs," one of the officers suggested. "Or stealing. Look at the way he's looking around." They exchanged glances and moved forward without further ado. The teenager noticed them as they approached. His chest tightened. It was a look he recognized immediately. Not the look of people defending the law, the look of people looking for an excuse. He didn't do anything wrong, but it never mattered. One of the policemen quickened his step a little, then stopped right in his path. The teenager slowed down, trying to remain calm. "Hey, buddy, stop for a minute," the officer said in a tone that was too careless, too relaxed. The teenager gulped. "What's the matter?" The second policeman went around the side of him, standing so as to close the way to retreat. "You look suspicious," the first one said without a shadow of emotion. "We have a crime problem here." "I'm just going home." The teenager's voice was steady, but a panicked heart was already beating in his chest. "Home, huh?" smirked the policeman. "Where's home?" "A couple blocks from here." "Really?" The cop pretended to be surprised. "Because, you look like you don't belong here, not the place." The words cut sharper than a blade. "I didn't do anything," the teen said slowly, forcing himself not to raise his voice. "And I hope that's true." The officer nodded, clutching his equipment belt. "Just show me the papers and we'll go our separate ways." The teenager tensed. He didn't have his papers. He didn't carry them with him because the wheelchair had no pockets to put them in. The policeman saw it, saw his gaze waver, and he smirked. "What? Is there a problem?" "I don't have my ID with me," the teen said cautiously. "That's what I thought." The policeman nodded. His face no longer looked relaxed. Now it was cold, blank, the face of a man who had just found an excuse. "Put your hands up," the second officer said. The teenager froze. "I can't." "What did you say?" The policeman took a sharp step closer. "I can't lift my arms. I have motor problems." "Really?" the first one said mockingly. "I think you just don't want to obey." They looked down at him. They weren't looking at him like a human being, as a problem that needs to be fixed. The crowd of passers-by began to slow their steps, some casting cautious glances, some quickly turning away. No one interfered. "Tell you what, since you won't cooperate, we're going to have to search you," the officer said calmly, taking a step forward. The teenager clenched his hands on the rims of the wheels. "I didn't do anything wrong." "That's for us to decide," the second policeman replied sharply. He was already reaching for his holster. No one has screamed yet. No one had fallen to the ground yet. But it was only a matter of time. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life. Share your thoughts. It's important to hear different voices. If you're interested in stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. The air around him seemed to thicken, sticky, heavy, pressurized. The city had a life of its own, but for the teenager in the wheelchair, the whole world had narrowed down to the two figures frozen in front of him. Two policemen whose gaze burned his skin, whose presence crushed him, displacing even oxygen. "I'll say it again," one of them said slowly, with pressure, leaning closer. "Where are your documents?" I don't have them with me." The teen's voice shook slightly, but he held himself back, didn't let the fear break through. "Not with me?" the second officer questioned, crossing his arms over his chest. Is this a joke? I live close by. I don't need papers to just—" He didn't finish. The words didn't make sense. They weren't listening. The first officer chuckled briefly. "Oh, I see. She lives nearby. Oh, sure. You sure it's in the most upscale neighborhood? I'm just coming home." "Coming back from where?" The teenager hesitated. Any answer could be a trap. "From the store." The policeman looked him over. "Store? Where's the shopping?" "I was just walking." The officer's face changed dramatically. "Walking? In a wheelchair?" The other shook his head, grinning mockingly. "You hear that, Johnson? He says he's just skating. He's just skating." "Yeah, it's a strange place to go for a walk," his partner said. They looked at each other. There was no doubt in their eyes, only a decision. That kid's hiding something. The first policeman took a step forward and his hand slowly slid to his holster. "Well, since you have no ID, since you can't explain what you're doing here, then we have every reason to conduct an inspection." The teen felt his breath catch. "A test? I didn't do anything." "Yeah? Come on, put your hands up." Everything squeezed inside. "I can't." Silence. The officer squinted his eyes. "What?" "I have motor problems. I can't lift my arms," the teen repeated, feeling panic rise to his throat. The policeman's eyes flashed with irritation. "Are you kidding me?" "No, I'm serious. I have, Enough," shouted the second officer, stepping closer. "They're all the same. First they don't hear the command. Then they start making excuses, and then—" He leaned in slowly, his face so close the teenager could feel his breath. "And then they're surprised when they find themselves face down in the mud." Intercepting his partner's gaze, he grinned. "He's not raising his hand, Johnson." "What's that?" "Insubordination," the first officer replied flatly, not removing his hand from his holster. "Exactly. And for insubordination, what do we do?" The teenager didn't even have time to respond. Jerk. A hand grabbed him roughly by the collar of his shirt. His body jerked forward, but the straps holding him in the wheelchair prevented him from being pulled out immediately. "Let go!" It came out of his chest, but it was useless. "Are you resisting?" hissed the officer. Snap. The plastic seat belt came undone, and the next moment the teen felt himself being jerked out of the wheelchair. The asphalt was approaching too fast. Punch. The world lost sound for a second. Only the ringing in my ears and the sharp jolt of pain that ran from my face to my spine. Someone shouted outside, but the cops weren't listening. "Hands behind your back." The teen tried to breathe, but something hot spilled into his mouth. He had bitten his lip in the fall. "Hands behind your back, you son of a bitch." "I can't. There was no response. All that followed was a knee coming down on his back. The asphalt was hot, rough, soaked with dirt and old oil, and its touch on his skin was far more painful than the teen had expected. His cheek hit the ground. His breathing hitched. The world lost its sharpness for a second. His whole body ached with a dull, aching pain from the fall, from the impact, from the brutality with which he'd been ripped from his wheelchair. And then came the pain for real. The policeman pressed his knee into his back with force before he even realized it. The weight of a grown man with full armor instantly turned his lungs into a compressed ball of air that could neither go in nor out. The teen tried to inhale, but couldn't. I can't breathe." He barely audibly muttered, his voice shaking, breaking into a wheeze. The officer didn't even look down. "Shut up." His voice was as firm as the pressure on his spine. The second policeman stood nearby with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the scene mockingly. "Holy shit, did you see him collapse?" He smirked. "And they say they can't walk." They laughed. The teenager tried to inhale again, but the knee on his back wouldn't move. Air was becoming a luxury, something unattainable. Panic began to overwhelm him and his hands twitched involuntarily, but the officer immediately squeezed them tighter. "Are you resisting?" he bellowed. No. The teenager exhaled. "I think you move around too much for an invalid." The policeman grinned, easing the pressure a little, only to immediately increase it again. Pressure. "You wanted attention, didn't you?" suddenly said the second officer, sitting down next to him so that their gazes met. "Well, are you satisfied? Take this." Outraged voices were heard somewhere around. People started to stop. Some of them had already taken out their cell phones. The cameras were pointed directly at them. "Let him go," some woman shouted. "He's not moving," someone else chimed in. The officer lifted his head, quickly glanced around the crowd. He saw the faces. People who deep down didn't want trouble. People who would make a video but do nothing. He grinned and shifted his gaze back to the teenager. Looks like we got a star. You think that's gonna help? You think someone's gonna come rescue you?" His partner looked at the phones in the hands of the gawkers, then slowly leaned forward. "Be thankful we're on camera." Laughter, heavy, cold, devoid of humanity. The teenager tried to get out a word, a sound, but his throat constricted, his lungs burning. His whole body shook. The blood pounded in his temples. It was getting dark. At some point, he realized that he couldn't hear any more, that the voices of the people around him were turning into a distant hum. My hands became absorbent cotton. The world was slowly dissolving, but the policeman still pressed on. The crowd thickened, the voices grew louder, but to the teenager in the wheelchair, it was a muffled hum, as if the world had suddenly gone underwater. He heard someone screaming, but he couldn't make out the words. His own breathing became jagged bursts of pain, short, insufficient, as if the air no longer wanted to fill his lungs. And the knee was still pressing, stronger, deeper, leaving no choice. "Let him go, he can't breathe," shouted the woman in the red sweater closest to him. "You're killing him," the man shouted, filming the whole thing on his phone. The policeman raised his head, looked around the crowd with a blank, cold stare. He didn't look scared. He didn't look worried. He just didn't care. "Back off," he said lazily. "Don't interfere with the work. This isn't a job, it's murder." The second officer suddenly hummed and turned to the crowd without rising from the teenager. "Do you care? Or do you just want likes for your video?" "This will be evidence in court," shouted the girl with the phone. The policeman grinned. "Court?" He looked at the teenager beneath him, then back at the people. "Don't you think you'll be told he was a threat?" The first officer, the one pressing with his knee, snorted. "And we knew he was dangerous." He slowly leaned lower, almost touching the teenager's ear with his lips. "Isn't it?" The teenager's body didn't move anymore. He didn't break free, didn't beg. He had no more strength. He was just trying to breathe. "He's not resisting," someone shouted again. "Yeah," one of the officers replied lazily, "because he knows he lost." There was panic in the crowd. "Is someone calling Homeland Security?" "They won't answer. Are you stupid? We have to do something." But what could they do? People never knew when to stop being mere bystanders and become part of what was happening. They were afraid that if they took a step forward, they would find themselves in the teenager's shoes. They were scared, and the officers knew it. The other raised his hand, placed his palm on his holster. "Step back." His voice was harsher now. "This is a lawful detention." The woman in the red sweater, who had been shouting the loudest a few seconds ago, suddenly fell silent. Her lips trembled, but she took a step back, just like the others. Someone was still making videos, but without the same old challenge. Everyone understood. If someone interferes, they're next. The policeman nodded to his partner. "I think he's already calmed down." The officer beneath him shook his head. "Yeah, now he knows who's in charge. Only the teenager didn't understand anything, because I couldn't feel anything else." When the pressure finally disappeared, the teenager didn't even feel relief. The air that should have returned to his lungs didn't come. He just lay on the sidewalk, face down, not moving, not making the slightest movement. The officer slowly rose to his feet, shook the dust off his uniform as if he had just done a routine job. For him, it was routine. "Have you learned to obey?" he said lazily, bowing his head. No answer. "Hey." The second policeman, the one who had been watching the whole time, stepped closer. The teenager's body still lay motionless. The crowd tensed. People were looking at each other, still filming, but there was fear in their gazes now. He'd gone too long without moving. The woman in the red sweater, the same one who had tried to scream, threw her hands up to her face. "Oh my God." The officers hesitated. They knew what they were doing, but they were not prepared for the consequences. "Check him out." The second policeman's voice was no longer so mocking. "Come on, he's faking it," the first one said, rolling his eyes. "They always do." The crowd froze. It was as if time had stopped. The policeman exhaled irritably and took a step forward. Punch. A black shoe slammed forcefully into the teenager's side. The crowd gasped. "Hey!" someone shouted out, but the officer didn't even pay attention. The body twitched weakly, but no more than that. "Pretending!" The policeman threw and grinned, but the grin quickly disappeared when one of the gawkers shouted, "He's not breathing!" The noise in the crowd grew. Panic turned to realization. They had done it. They had killed him. "He's not breathing! He's not moving!" someone else shouted. The woman in the red sweater was already crying, covering her mouth with her hands. The policemen looked at each other but did not move. Their faces, a moment ago full of self-confidence, suddenly turned gray. "He's breathing," one of them hissed, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. "Then let him get up," shouted the man with the phone. "Get him up. Show me he's okay." The officer looked down. The boy really didn't move. His chest didn't rise. His face was pressed against the sidewalk, his lips cracked, drops of blood frozen on the lower one. "Shit." The second officer gulped. "Shit, shit, shit." The crowd was no longer just watching. People began to step forward. "You killed him." That was no longer a question. The cop, the one who had been kicking the teenager, suddenly snatched up the walkie-talkie and squeezed it so hard his knuckles turned white. "We have a possible medical situation here." The crowd exploded with anger. "A medical situation? You killed a baby. You smashed his head into the ground and crushed him with your knee. He's not breathing and you're just now calling for help." The officers did not answer. They heard the rumble of voices, saw someone moving closer, but now they were no longer masters of the situation. The crowd was now stronger than they were. "An ambulance is on the way," one of them threw in, but his voice shook. "Would have been on its way if you had called it in 10 minutes ago." Someone tried to approach the teen, but the officer raised his hand. "Don't touch him. This is a crime scene." The men looked at each other. "Crimes?" One of them coldly interjected. "Yes, a crime. Only you are the criminals here." The cops weren't joking around anymore. They felt fear for the first time in a long time. Let's pause for a little more. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether something similar has happened in your life. Your thoughts and experiences are important. Every story matters. If you're interested in topics like this, subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. The crowd was no longer silent. People shouted, demanded, cursed. The sound of voices, heated, angry, rumbled over the street, filling every inch of space. Some begged for medics to be called faster. Others shouted the officers' names, promising they would not get away with it again. The phones were pointed at them, and now even they realized it. But the boy still didn't move. And that's what became the problem. Ambulance sirens cut through the air. Somewhere ahead, around the corner, flashes of red and white were already flashing. A few more seconds, and the car would be here. The policemen, who a moment ago had looked unruffled, now looked at each other. The second officer pressed his lips together, his fingers frantically touching the radio. The first, the one who had been pressing his knee against the teenager's back the whole time, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. The crowd took a step closer, and it was at that exact moment that something clicked in the first officer's mind. His hand jerked to his belt, and before anyone could react, he pulled out a gun. The world froze. "Stand back!" he shouted, pointing his muzzle at the motionless body. The crowd stiffened. The anger that had just been in the air was suddenly replaced by paralyzing terror. "What the hell are you doing?" His partner exhaled, but he didn't answer. The policeman looked down, at the boy, at the threat. He could be dangerous. Those words sounded like a judgment. "Are you serious?" shouted someone from the crowd. "You just crushed him. He's not even moving." "He can mimic," the cop said flatly, his finger tense on the trigger. "Are you crazy?" The second officer tried to take a step forward, but the one holding the weapon raised his hand, causing him to freeze. "I don't know what he's holding." The crowd gasped. "He's got nothing," shouted the woman in the red sweater. "His hands are behind his back." Someone else. "He's in a wheelchair. What are you talking about?" But the officer didn't hear any more, or pretended not to. The ambulance was already pulling into the street, its siren ringing in my ears. The crowd was panicked, but no one moved. No one wanted to provoke a gunshot, a shot to the body that couldn't even defend itself. "Put the fucking gun down," his partner again, more insistent now. "Do you hear yourself? If he rushes—" The officer with the gun clenched his teeth, his palm trembling, but his grip on the weapon remained ironclad. "How the hell's he going to rush if he's not even breathing?" Snap. His pinky finger was on the trigger. The crowd gasped. But at the same instant, two paramedics jumped out of the ambulance and one of them literally rushed forward. "Put the gun down. We need to inspect it." The officer blinked, as if snapping out of some kind of trance. For a second, just a second, he hesitated. Then he slowly jerked his hand away, still not putting the gun away. The crowd gasped again. Paramedics rushed to the teen's body, turned him over, checked his pulse. One of them looked at the other. Their faces turned grim. The woman in the red sweater began to pray. The policeman stood there, not knowing what to do. The crowd was getting closer, and now it wasn't just an angry mob. They were witnesses. The gun slowly lowered, but the tension didn't go away. It only intensified. The crowd watched as the barrel was returned to its holster with a trembling hand, but the policeman's fingers clenched the grip to the last, as if he wasn't sure if he should put the weapon away, as if, even now, as the teenager's body remained motionless, he still saw him as a threat. But the threat wasn't a teenager anymore, and they are. The policemen looked at each other. They saw the expressions on the faces of the people around them, saw how the atmosphere had changed. No one was afraid of them anymore. No one stood there with their eyes downcast, pretending that nothing was happening. Everyone understood. 2 paramedics ran out of the ambulance, but as one of them tried to lean over the body, his path was blocked by the same officer who had just held a gun. "Wait!" The man in the blue uniform froze, his face contorted with incomprehension. "Are you serious? We need to take a look at him, you understand?" The policeman shook his head slowly, still keeping his hand on his holster. "We have to make sure he's safe." These words hung in the air like thunder. The crowd exploded. "What did you just say? Safe? He's not moving, you bastard. You just crushed him. You think he's got a gun? In a wheelchair?" The paramedic clenched his fists, his face red with rage. "You killed him, and now you won't even let us check?" The second officer stepped closer to his partner, cast a quick glance at the crowd, at the cameras, at the teenager who still hadn't moved. "We need to get a handle on the situation," he said in a steady voice, but there was a barely concealed nervousness in it. "Situation?" someone shouted. "The situation is that you have a dead teenager in front of you, and you're acting like he's a terrorist." The woman in the red sweater who was crying earlier suddenly took a step forward. "If you won't let the doctors examine him, we'll do it ourselves." "Get back!" shouted the officer, putting his hand on his holster again. The crowd didn't move. They were no longer intimidated by guns, badges, or cold stares. They saw everything. They knew the truth. The cop, the one still standing between the paramedics and the teen's body, swallowed nervously. He could feel the situation spiraling out of control. "It's not your job. It's our job." "Your job?" The man with the phone, who had been filming the whole thing from the beginning, stepped closer. "Our job is to make sure that people like you couldn't do that anymore." The second policeman looked at his partner, then at the crowd, then back at the teenager. He still hadn't been touched. Not a single person but them dared to touch him, like it was a corpse. The woman in the red sweater tried to approach again. The officer grabbed the handcuffs. "I said, get back." And that's when the crowd exploded, shouting, cursing, shoving. Someone tried to break forward. Someone grabbed the officer's arm. Phones shook in people's hands, recording everything, every movement, every facial expression. "Get them away from him," shouted the paramedic. But the police officers were no longer in control of the situation. The situation was now in control of them. Stories don't die. They fly apart, break through the concrete of walls, make headlines, flash across the news airwaves. Video footage shot by eyewitnesses filled the internet in just a few hours. The footage of a teenager in a wheelchair being dragged to the ground, pressed against the pavement, crushed with a knee and then kicked, went viral. Millions of views, millions of comments. But the police report made it look different. The official version: the suspect actively resisted law enforcement officers. After repeatedly refusing to comply with officers' lawful requests, he attempted an assault, endangering public safety. The use of force was a coercive measure. The crowd, the cameras, the eyewitnesses, none of that was in the report. Instead, there was the image of a dangerous teenager, black, in a wheelchair, the one who brought it on himself. The news channels split into two camps. Some defended police officers. They were acting on instructions. Police are always in danger, especially in neighborhoods like this. And if he had a gun? Others showed the video. Where's the attack? How can you resist if you're paralyzed? Do you see what they did to him? There were experts, former officers, and public figures on talk shows. Some assured that everything was overblown. Others shouted about systemic racism. The teen's lawyers said it wasn't just abuse, it was an execution. When the pressure became too great, the mayor made a statement. He stood in front of the cameras, his voice clear but his eyes tired. We will conduct a thorough investigation. The perpetrators will be held accountable. But no one believed it. Everyone knew how the system worked. When an innocent man dies, he is first made guilty. Protests broke out across the cities. People came out with placards, chanting names, demanding justice. But there was another force at work behind the scenes. Police were hurriedly covering up evidence. The teen's past began to be dug up. What if he's been caught doing something suspicious before? What if there are criminals in his family? What if he has a criminal record? They didn't want the truth. They needed a reason to say he deserved it. But the evidence wasn't working. There were too many videos. There were too many witnesses. Public anger has gotten too loud. The officers were suspended. It sounded like a victory, but people knew it was just a move to quiet the crowd. They won't get anything. They'll be back in 6 months. The system always protects its own. But this time, the story could no longer be forgotten. Too many people were watching, and too many people no longer believed the lies. Stories don't end. They just turn into symbols. The name of a teenager in a wheelchair has become a slogan. His face appeared on posters, murals, T-shirts. Crowds of people shouted his name, shouting words that the police tried to erase from history. But words are not erased by being repeated by millions. The city plunged into protests. Every night, the streets were filled with people holding pictures, candles, banners. They stood in front of police cordons, in front of courthouses, in front of the mayor's offices. They demanded justice. But justice in this country always has a price. The officers were tried. The trial was high profile. It was headline news. People at the screens, people in the hall, people in the streets. Everyone was watching. First officer, the one who kneed, the one who kicked, the one who grinned. Second officer, the one who watched, who didn't stop, who covered for his partner. Prosecutors talked about brutality. The defense talked about abuse of power under stress. They tried to convince everyone that the cops weren't monsters, that they made a mistake. The video was shown in court, slow motion, frame by frame, how a teenager in a wheelchair was just driving home, how he was pulled over for no reason, how he was pulled to the ground, how a knee put pressure on his back, how he stopped moving. People in the audience closed their eyes, but the images remained conscious. 3 months later, the court entered judgment. First officer, guilty. Manslaughter, 3 years in prison. Officer 2, guilty. Excessive force, probation. The crowd in front of the courthouse was silent. 3 years, whispered a woman in a red sweater standing in the front row. For murder? That's not justice. It's a spit in the face. And then the people shouted again. The system gave minimal punishment. But no one was surprised. Protests continued, but now the police responded more harshly. Arrests, tear gas dispersals, batons on backs, on heads, on faces. Once again, cameras captured the violence. Every day there were new videos, new victims, new names chanted by the crowd. But people were getting more tired each time. Reality was brutal. The system doesn't collapse because of one case. The system has survived thousands of such stories. And yet they kept coming out, because they knew that if they kept quiet, it would happen again. What happened to the killers? First officer, out on parole after 18 months. Second officer, returned to the police after 1 year. When asked if he regretted what had happened, his answer was short. "I was just doing my job." What happened to the teenager's family? They filed a civil suit. They received compensation of several million. They didn't want money anymore. They wanted their son. What happened to the city? Nothing. Police officers still patrol the streets. Black teenagers are still afraid to meet them. Parents continue to teach their children that not all men in uniform protect the law. And every night, someone leaves a candle in the park where that boy once lived. Because stories don't die. But justice can sometimes be bitter. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? Your stories and opinions are very important to us. We value each and every one of you. If these topics resonate with you, please subscribe to the channel and give us a like. It helps us to keep telling important stories. Write the phrase, "Justice should be real," in the comments so we know who listened to the end. Have a good day and peace all around you.